Welcome to another random walk down Mill Street. Um, Tonight's topic is raisin wine, grape juice, and prohibition. Uh, just out of curiosity, I see there's already something in the chat. Let's take a look. Post links to the videos. It's going to be a little bit hard for me because I didn't prepare in advance, but if you go to my YouTube channel, which is in the link for where they have the link for this class. At the bottom, there's a link to that, and you just type in Passover, you'll get a whole bunch of them. And if you want to drill down further, email me directly, and I'll tell you where to find individual parts. But okay, thank you, Alexander. Raisin wine, grape juice, and prohibition. Just out of curiosity, does anyone here in this class make raisin wine for Pesach? Anybody? Has anyone ever heard of that custom to make raisin wine for Pesach? No. Okay. I think Rabbi Kretzmer Seed has. So that's one thumbs up. But okay. And a couple. Very interesting. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's actually a pretty big topic, which I'm going to try to not get lost in. And I've given a similar class before many years ago where I really emphasized the halachic nature. Not going to talk about that much. We'll go just a little bit. We're not going to talk about the halachic questions much. And we are going to talk about some of the history involved. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get right into it. Just making sure you can see my screen. It says random walk down Mill Street, raisin wine, grape juice, and prohibition, April 17th, 2024. Yes? Great. Okay. I don't even know what Camp Your Day is, but sounds very interesting. We'll have to figure that out later. Okay. So we're going to start in 1840. Could probably I did try to go a little earlier, but we'll start in 1840. And the background to this is there is in America from about the middle of the 1820s, 1830s, a temperance movement. Not only in America, it happens in England and elsewhere, but in America there is a temperance movement, which is to avoid alcohol, to ban alcohol, to prohibit alcohol, anything that can get you drunk. For obvious reasons, the people who were behind it thought it was uncouth, essentially. People did not behave morally when they were drunk. They made bad decisions when they were inebriated. And they made it a crusade. And I say that religiously because it was essentially a religious kind of movement, which often tried to bring proofs from the New Testament or the Old Testament or Jewish practice to support this movement to limit the consumption of alcohol in America. And one of the works that was published about it is called Anti-Bacchus, as you can see here. This is just the cover page on the left. It was actually published in London. But then shortly thereafter, there was an American edition, published in New York, with additions by the Reverend John Marsh from the American Temperance Union. And as an appendix to this very large book is a letter that was written by Mordechai Manuel Noah. I should have put a picture of Mordechai Manuel Noah. Now that I'm talking about him, I realize that I could have, there's the big picture of him, big portrait of him right in our lobby. But Mordechai Emanuel Noah was the most famous Jew in America before the Civil War. I've given classes about him before. I've talked to him as a proto-Zionist. He's a politician. He had an interesting character. Today, he's not remembered all that well, especially for his views on slavery and minstrel shows in New York in the middle of the 19th century. But he's also remembered positively because he had this idea that Jews should have their own homeland well before Herzl and tried to act on it, but that's for another class. So he writes this letter in answer to an inquiry by a minister in about 1839, 1840, and we'll read it. In answer to an inquiry from Mr. Delvan to Mordechai Emanuel Noah, Esquire, as to the kind of wine used at the Passover, Mr. Noah made the following reply. I have your favor requesting to know how the wine is prepared for Passover. So somebody in the temperance movement wants to know how Jews drink wine on Pesach. And who do they ask? Mordechai Emanuel Noah, the most famous Jew in America in 1840. And so Mordechai Emanuel Noah writes back, if you wish to make a small quantity for the communion table, for the wine will soon grow sour, having no alcoholic body, take a gallon demijohn or stone jug, pick 3 or 4 pounds of bloom raisins, break off the stems, put the raisins in the demijohn, fill it with water, tie a rag over the mouth, place it near the fire, and on one side of the fireplace to keep it warm. In about a week, it will be fit for use, making a pure, pleasant, and sweet wine free from alcohol. So the first thing he does is not answer the question. He just says, here's how you make it. If you want to make it for your church, this is what you do. And then he gets to it at the end. This is the wine we use on the nights of the Passover because it is free from fermentation, as we are strictly prohibited not only from eating leavened bread, but from drinking fermented liquors. So Mordechai Emanuel Noah says the custom is to make this wine for use on Pesach, which is not alcoholic. It is unfermented grape, raisin wine, I should say. Tells you how to make it because we can't have any alcohol on Pesach, which is exactly what this minister wanted to hear, what the temperance movement wanted to hear. Not allowed to drink. Jews for Passover don't drink alcohol. So why is that important for them? Because then they go back to the New Testament and they say, Jesus didn't drink wine. He drank raisin wine. He drank non-alcoholic wine, not fermented wine. That's important for them. We don't need to get into it. That's the story. But what do we get from this? Mordechai Emanuel Noah is telling everybody, this is how you make wine for Pesach. You make it with raisins. You basically soak the raisins and get some wine out of it. Non-alcoholic wine. There's lots of questions which we'll try to address a little later. But right away, right after this thing is published, there is a little editorial, very short, October 21st, 1840, in the New York Daily Herald. Judge Noah, at that time, Mordechai Emanuel Noah was, I think, a judge on the customs court in New York, has told only a part of the truth with regard to the element used by the Jews at the celebration of the Passover. Many of them use cider. Can't make this up. And many use uncolored Jamaica rum. Besides, the raisin wine is a fermented liquor. If it does not make one drunk, it sure acts as a cathartic, meaning it's good to you take a little drink raisin wine. It's good for you. It does have alcohol in it. And then the reason I show this to you is the real point of it, not the veracity of what the editorial says. It says, As most of the Jews are Harrison men, cider will become the more common element during Pesach. Wine savors too much Van Burenism. This question, the temperance movement, and what Mordechai Emanuel Noah says about raisin wine and alcohol and the consumption of alcohol on Passover is part and parcel. He's basically saying Mordechai Emanuel Noah is a politician. And this whole, the way he responded has to do with which candidate he favors and how they view the temperance movement, and not the truth about what Jews consume on Pesach. Nevertheless, the making and drinking of raisin wine was very common and essentially considered a minhag, a custom, maybe even a halacha almost of American Jewry. And not only in America, but in Europe also is very, very common. Today, you don't hear about people making their own wine using raisins, but it was once very, very common. And I give you one example, which actually comes from London from 1838, just a few years earlier, from a book called Tales of a Jewess by Madame Brendla. It's interesting, so we're going to read this little paragraph. And it's talking about preparations for Passover. There she found all bustle and working. Everything was to be moved. All the house was to be painted and well scoured. Nothing but scrubbing, cleaning, and washing could be done until the next week, for then it would be Pesach, when no Jew on pain of excommunication must touch or allow anything to be used that ever had been used at any other time of the year. Pretty true. Not exactly accurate, but pretty true. All the crockery ware was put away, packed up and locked up. The cooking utensils were safely deposited away until the Passover should be over. Oh, what a fuss, work, bustle, and confusion is the feast of the unleavened bread, in which nothing is eaten but Passover cakes, matzah, and puddings made with the flour of powdered matzers. The cheese, butter, rum must be kosher and stamped by the Raf, and naught must be drunk but raisin wine made in a kosher barrel. Pretty accurate description of preparing for Passover. Some of you might be doing that right now. But obviously the punchline for our purposes tonight is the last line. The only drink that they could have was raisin wine made from a kosher barrel. And I think here is the key. This has nothing to do with the consumption of alcohol, but it has everything to do with making sure it's kosher for Passover, or just making sure it's kosher, period. How do you get kosher wine? You make it, because it's not like you just have the kosher wine store on the corner with every kind of wine you could imagine. I'm going to pause here and take a look at the chat to make sure I didn't miss anything. By cider, they mean apple cider. I actually have no idea. Probably. No, I think raisin wine is much more close to grape juice, as we'll see later. Okay. So, fast forward a few decades, and you can actually start to get wine. But in the early decades of American Jewish history, it was very difficult to find wine. So here, writing in 1859, is Isaac Leeser, and he's actually talking about Jewish views on temperance, this exact question. And he's talking about this particular question about wine on Passover, or wine in general. It says, for religious purposes, we uniformly exclude Gentile wines from the ceremonies. Absolutely correct. We don't drink non-kosher wine, we would say, Gentile wine. Hence, in the countries where the vine is not cultivated, we resort to artificial wine, such as raisin wine, or even cider, lemonade, mead made from honey. But seldom on such occasions do we employ spirituously fermented liquor. It says we don't really use alcohol much. We try to use cider or raisin wine or lemonade or mead. So there is alcohol, I guess, but not strong spirits. And never, so far as my knowledge goes, this is Isaac Leeser, is a pretty good witness. Never, so far as my knowledge goes, on the Passover nights, when uniformly the unintoxicating preparations are used, if Jewish wine is not readily accessible. This is not, however, on temperance principles, but because all fermented liquors of which grain is the basis are leaven and therefore strictly prohibited. So he sort of mixes up a few things here, and I think on purpose, but he's saying it's not a temperance issue. You can't have any grain-based alcohol, so we don't have, vodka or whiskey or whatever. Kentucky bourbon. But so we make raisin wine. But he also says if Jewish wine is not readily accessible. But already by 1859, when he's writing, there are advertisements in his very newspaper, The Occident, and I put a few of them here. Right here. C. Nussbaum, 187 Rivington Street, offers imported wine and groceries for Pesach. You can get kosher wine for Pesach if you know who to contact. By the way, this C. Nussbaum, what is 187 Rivington Street where it's selling wine and groceries? It's not a grocery store. It's a farm store. Large collection of Hebrew prayer and classical books. All year long, he sells Judaica. Before Pesach, he sells groceries. That's his business. So it is possible by the middle of the 19th century to get kosher wine, but even so, in 1859, Leeser is saying everybody uses raisin wine on Pesach. Everybody uses raisin wine. That situation continues even as late as 1881. We see a letter by Philip Joachimson. Philip Joachimson is a very interesting person. I'd like to do a class on him one day. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He was actually a pretty high-ranking officer in the Union Army in the Civil War. Gets injured on his falling off of a horse. That's a story for another day. But he is a prominent person and a judge in New York. And he is a member of Shearith Israel. And in fact, at certain times, he's the president of Shearith Israel. He may even have been the president in 1881 when he's writing this letter. But this is very similar to what happened 40 years earlier. The temperance movement is still moving on. And they're still talking about what the Jews do on Passover and what the Jews drink, what wines do Jews drink. And there was a letter from Dr. Sampson asking this and published in the newspaper. And Joachimson responds. February 15th, 1881, Reverend, dear sir, in answer to your favor of yesterday's date, I repeat that the great majority of conforming Jews in this city use wine made from raisins at Passover. Of course, the raisins are fresh. I don't even know what fresh raisins means. Such raisin wine is used in all conforming synagogues for the sanctification of Shabbat and holy days. So it's not just Passover, but it's also Kiddush, i.e. Kiddush, and for services at circumcisions and weddings. This is what we use, raisin wine. Some, but not many, people use imported wine, Italian, Hungarian, German, which is certified as Perach. I think it's supposed to say Pesach, kosher for Passover, or kosher wine. Yours truly, P.J. Joachimson. So there you go. Even in 1881, now it's 40 years later, you can get wine, but everybody's making raisin wine for Pesach in particular, but through all year long also. And why? He doesn't say it explicitly, but it's because that's the only kosher wine you could get, or that's what traditionally people thought of as kosher wine. So what happens with raisin wine? Raisin wine sort of falls apart. In the 1870s and 1880s, California wines start being distributed, and there is a great push for kosher California wines. I should have had a slide about it, but there were people involved from the Spanish Portuguese community in San Francisco who were involved in making kosher wine, and it becomes controversial at some points. But needless to say, they start making wine in California, and some of it is certified as kosher, and the whole raisin wine thing starts to disappear as kosher wine is much more readily available. You can import it at great cost, or you can get it from California for much cheaper. Then we get actual prohibition. I think it's the 18th Amendment. I could be a little bit off. But you get Prohibition 1920. So we're moving steadily forward in time, where the government prohibited the consumption of alcohol except for certain special dispensations, medicinal use or sacramental use. And a whole bureaucracy builds up around getting wine from your rabbi because you are an observant Jew. Same thing happens in every religion. Suddenly everybody is very religious and needs to get their sacramental wine. And in the archives of Sheretz Israel are all sorts of bureaucratic documents related to wine procurement for the synagogue, for its congregants, during Prohibition. And here's a blank form that you can see here that was used in the early 1920s, where you have to list the name of the church, the name of the minister, when they have services, how many congregants there are, and then the rabbi can get wine. He can be certified to get wine for the congregation. There's documents filled out by David Solapool, notarized, stamped, all sorts of things about the location of the synagogue, how many congregants there are, whatever was required by the bureaucracy in order to fulfill these sacramental wine orders. Excuse me. So that becomes a big deal. And abuses also arise. It's like cat and mouse games, the government wants this, then they realize, well, people are abusing it, so then they change the rules, they change the requirements. This happens many times, and we constantly see different forms. 1920, there's one kind of form. 1925, there's another kind of form. Then they get a letter from the Treasury Department amending the rules. This is what you have to do. This is what you have to do. They're always jumping through hoops. That's the wrong way. But here you can see, beginning in the middle of the 1920s, there are efforts to limit rabbi sale of religious wines. Initially, there was 5-gallon. You could get 5 gallons, and they said no, individuals shouldn't drink more than a gallon of wine. They don't need to buy 5 gallons of wine. So each adult in the family. They're playing games. Changing the regulations as they go along. The whole prohibition bureaucracy of the 1920s. And then you get in 1925, 1926, let me just make this a little smaller. New rules for church wine. Sacramental permits call for names of all users. This was something new. Beforehand, you just needed to get it from your rabbi. The rabbi said he needs this many, he has 400 congregants, he could get such and such quantity, and they would distribute it. Beginning in 1925, the government said, no, we need details. Who's getting the wine? Where do they live? How much wine are they getting? The synagogue has to keep much better records. And so we get lists. The first list was a list of all the members of the congregation, 400 that he had earlier had. There was a list of all the names. I liked a bunch of my family was on there. Then there's a list of who actually got wine, much smaller list than the 400. This is the list here in 1925 or 1926. 35 gallons of wine were bought by the above congregants. Proud to see some of my relatives were among them. And others, including Dr. Poole himself. And the Chazan, Wachnon. So what we have here is evolving bureaucracy. And in 1926, when they issue new rules that were going to become effective in 1927, made it much more complicated. Dr. Poole writes a letter to the president of the congregation, whose name is Henry Hendricks, 3-page letter outlining all the new regulations and how difficult it's going to be for the congregation to get wine for everybody. I don't need to go through all the details, but some of them are actually kind of interesting. Some of the details he records in here is kind of interesting. So we'll just get a few highlights. One is that they have to keep an exact record of who's getting it, how much they're getting. They have to store it on site in the synagogue. They can't just say, go to the distributor and pick it up, go downtown, go pick it up from somebody else, and here's a letter. Can't do that. Has to go to the synagogue in very specific quantities, lots of detail, lots of record keeping, forms, notarizations, all sorts of things that make it complicated. But they're going, Dr. Poole is assuming that we're going to keep doing what we're doing and getting alcohol for our congregants. And he's alerting the board, saying it's going to be more complicated this year. I need your help earlier. But some of the things are interesting here. So first, he makes a push for, instead of California wines, he says Palestinian wines are getting cheaper these days. We should get Israel. We should get wines from Palestine. And he gives the quotes to how much they cost. And that it's kosher under the Rabbi Cook and Rabbi Sonnenfeld, and just he's pushing not domestic wines, he's pushing wines from Palestine, which is kind of nice. Then look at this last paragraph. It is interesting to note that several congregations have taken advantage of the comparative cheapness of the Palestinian wine. Before it used to be much more expensive, now it's cheaper, and have added a few dollars to the cost that they're going to charge the congregant. So synagogue will get it for whatever, $15 a case. We'll sell it for 20. We'll make a little money on the side. And then he says, that's what other synagogues are doing. Then he says, this, I presume, is something that we would be quite unwilling to do. And I don't think he's being facetious at all. Although I think today, I don't think the rabbi would write the same line. That was something that he thought that, other synagogues would do. That's below us at Shereth Israel to make a profit on this business. But selling wine was a business. Selling wine during Prohibition was a business. Lots of rabbis did it. Lots of synagogues did it. Lots of synagogues had their congregations swell because of Prohibition. So here is the response from the president of the congregation. My dear Dr. Poole, the matter of the distribution of sacramental wines to the members of the congregation under the new regulations of the Prohibition administration was brought to my attention by your favor of the 10th. That was the letter we just looked at. It was carefully considered at the meeting of the Board of Trustees held on Adar 28. I like how he's mixing up Hebrew and English dates. It was then resolved that in view of the fact that such distribution would place a great responsibility upon the Board of Trustees and officers of the congregation as might be called upon to undertake the distribution, it's going to be complicated to do this thing. And in view of the fact that neither the Jewish law nor the minhag of this congregation, requires the use of intoxicating wine in home ceremonies, that the congregation do not undertake to distribute wine to its members. This has been a change. We used to get wine for our members. There were lists of people who got it. Now, beginning in 1927, no more. It's further resolved that such wine may be necessarily used for synagogue use. So we can still get wine to give out at Kiddush, but we're not going to get wine for our congregants. And that is what they do. But I want to just go back to what he said. He said, you don't need to have wine. As we know, the congregation's minhag was to make raisin wine. So what happens during Prohibition? Take a look here. This is the top right. Use Welch's kosher unfermented wine for Passover. What is kosher unfermented wine? It's grape juice. Welch's grape juice. Use Welch's kosher unfermented wine for Passover. That's the advertisement you see here. By the way, this is an actual document in the folder about wine in the archives. So this isn't like something I picked up on the internet. Dr. Poole is saving the ads that come to the synagogue. One of them is for Welch's grape juice with a big hashgacha here. I'm not going to get into the halachos of it, but the halachot of it. But suffice it to say that al pi adin, you can squeeze grapes and make kiddush on it. So grape juice should be fine. It gets a little more complicated for Pesach itself, where there seems to be a preference to have actual wine as opposed to grape juice. But it seems like lichatchila, if that's what you got, that's okay. Now, I just want to show you something that today a lot of people use grape juice that's what they prefer, perhaps, for whatever reason. But grape juice is complicated. And I don't want to get into the actual nitty-gritties, but I just want to show that the kashrut, or the advisability of using grape juice for Pesach, gets much more complicated than you might imagine. You just, most people, I think, they get grape juice for the kids, for those who don't want to drink wine. But take a look at the 1, 2, and 3 in the left-hand corner. This is from the OU. The OU is one of the major, kosher symbols in the country. There are others. There are 3 different types of kosher grape juice being certified. 1, the grape juice bottles that state on their labels that they are mivushal, which means that they have been boiled, pasteurized, are accepted by all as mivushal. That seems like a sine qua non, but that's what number 1 says. 2, the grape juice bottles that state on their labels not mivushal are accepted by all as not mivushal. Everybody says that if it says not mivushal, okay, thank you very much. It says not mivushal, okay. But now you get number 3. The grape juice on the bottles that don't say anything about whether it's mivushal or not mivushal. There's no information. Now there are 2 options. According to one rabbi that sell a marav, they're not mivushal. According to Moshe Feinstein and the OU, they are mivushal. Who cares about all this stuff? Let's just suffice to say that some people say that boiled wine, mivushal wine, is not really wine at all. And so boiled wine shouldn't be used for Passover. Then again, other people say you should use mivushal wine, because then you'll have no question that it might be stam yenam, or maybe someone touched it that shouldn't have touched it, or poured it that shouldn't have poured it. Maybe some people say prefer mivushal. Some people say prefer not mivushal wine, for a whole host of reasons that don't matter here. I just want to show you that even today, the kashrut of something simple like grape juice is way more complicated than you would ever imagine. Who knew that there are 3 different labels, and the one that doesn't say anything is the most complicated of all? Okay. That's all I'm going to get into the halachot. Not going to get any deeper than that. But I am going to show you more grape juice. This is also in Sheretz Israel's archives. Eshkol brand kosher unfermented wine. Kosher unfermented wine. Kosher unfermented wine. Who's making it? The Welch Grape Juice Company. So instead of calling it unfermented wine, just call it grape juice. But they don't want to say that. They want to say that it's unfermented wine for sacramental use. They're competing with the synagogues. It's prohibition time. And they are competing with the synagogues who are selling wine imported from Israel, from California, And so they're calling it unfermented wine instead of calling it grape juice, so that you can use it on Pesach. And the whole idea is that it's kosher for use on Pesach for the Haggadah. And so you get a whole description. This wine is proper for sacramental purposes. It may be used for the blessing. This is Welch's company, grape juice company, telling you this. May be used for the grace on the Sabbath and all holidays, including Passover, family celebrations, weddings, etc. In fact, it may be used at any time by the most conscientious Jew, because it is manufactured of all the laws or traditions bearing the kosher wine have been carefully followed. This is attested on every bottle by the Union of Orthodox Rabbis of America, United States and Canada. It goes on. Also, it has conservative rabbis, reform rabbis. It covers everything. And then there's a letter here. I don't know if you can see it. Excuse me. This is a letter written by Rabbi Young. Rabbi Young was the rabbi of the Jewish Center on 86th Street. I'm very happy to hear. It's written to Mr. Schwarzschild, who was a member of the Jewish Center, by the way, but also one of the people who was making Welch's grape juice. I am very happy to hear that the Welch Grape Juice Company is producing the Eshkol unfermented wine under proper rabbinic supervision. All loyal Jews can drink it without any misgiving. There is a whole discussion we could have about who says you can drink grape juice and who says you can't drink grape juice. But I don't need to get into it, other than to say that it's most rabbis of the era say you could drink grape juice, but even some pretty important rabbis said you can't use grape juice at the Haggadah, at the Seder. So he's saying he's making a ruling for his congregation and for everybody, but it's a little more complicated than he's making it out to be. That is grape juice at the Seder, unfermented wine. This is raisin wine. This is what Mordechai Emanuel Noah was talking about all the way back in the middle of the 19th century, the early 19th century, brought forward to the 20th century. Ancient solution for modern day problems. You got prohibition, no problem. We'll make raisin wine. We'll call it unfermented wine. We'll sell it. We'll sell it for whatever, however many dollars a case, and everyone will be happy. So now I'm just going to the thing that I can't really show you so easily, and I'm trying to give this to you. There are so many brochures, so many sales letters. This was one for grape juice, but Dr. Poole is receiving from distributor after distributor saying, we have kosher wines to sell you. We have kosher wines from Israel. We have kosher wines from California. This here letter. So you saw one about grape juice with Rabbi Young. Here's a letter from, look, Moshe Zvulun Margolis, Ramaz Margolis, KJ, synagogue on the east side. Says, dear Rabbi Poole, you should use my son-in-law's wine company, Colonial Grape Products. They're California wines. They're great. You can use them. They're perfectly kosher for Pesach. Okay. And then you have Dr. Poole himself writing to the board of trustees, to Captain N. Taylor Phillips in 1932, is a little later, saying, I find that you can get wines from Israel. Carmel, Rishon LeZion wines are available now. And they're, why not go for Israeli wine? He was a real Zionist. He didn't want to get wines from California if they could get a competitive price from the wines from Israel. And so he's advocating getting the Palestinian wine for sacramental purposes at the new reduced prices. It's just prevalent. And I'm not casting any aspersions. I'm just noting that there's a lot of business going on. And lots of people are trying to sell wine with hashgacha, and every rabbi is lined up with their favorite product. And that's the way it was during Prohibition. So then we finally finish off what they started. So there's 20 of these. Maybe too many, but there's a whole stack of these kinds of application to procure wine for sacramental purposes for religious rites. This is after the new regulations, where the synagogue said, we're not selling to anybody, but we'll get wine for ourselves. And so it's a whole thing stamped by the commissioner, notarized, how much they need. Every time they need to get more, they have to ask for more. So they're only getting 2 gallons here. They have to get another 4 gallons. Everything requires an application. There's letters from the Treasury Department. The whole bureaucracy is evidenced in our archives. And then you get letters like this. There's more than one, but this is just one, which is like the result of what the synagogue decided in 1927. And this is a letter to the supervisor of the Bureau of Industrial Alcohol. This is the Department of the Treasury. Dear Mr. Moss, Congregation Sheretz Israel makes no application for sacramental wine for the use of its individual members. We're not selling to our people, but by resolution of the Board of Trustees, we need sacramental wine for our own purposes for the synagogue itself. And we need 2 gallons, since whatever goes through the details. And every time they need more, so they'll get one. I need 3 gallons, I need 4 gallons. We used this much last year. We need this much for the next year. That's what it was like during Prohibition. And I don't know if you can see here, but they got wines from Palestine. They got Rishon LeZion wine. Dr. Poole won out. They didn't get Ramaz Margolis's wine, and they didn't get grape juice. They got Rishon LeZion wine. And that is the end of my presentation, but for one thing. I've known about this topic for a long time. I've been interested in this topic. I've spoken about it on other occasions. And I'm always curious to know if people have the custom of making raisin wine. It seemed to have been very prevalent in the 19th century and forgotten about today. And I have a email list of our members and friends of the congregation who are descended from early American families. And in 2022, 2 years ago, I wrote to this group and I said, does anybody have any interesting Passover customs that you keep in your families from early America? And I got a response from one of the recipients. Happens to be a prominent family in our congregation. And I just want to read to you his email. It's from David Nathan. Let's see if I can read. I'm not going to share the screen, but I'm going to read to you what he says. Thanks, Z. That's to the email I sent. I doubt there is too much from the Nathan legacy. His family goes back to colonial America. We do still have raisin-based charoset that I remember from the seders of my great aunt Rosalie. We'll talk about that another year. And from time to time, we create raisin wine made from pouring boiling water over raisins encased in cheesecloth from the old seders that he remembered when he was a kid. So there are people. And then he says, I have no idea how far back that recipe or custom goes. Well, I don't see him on tonight, but that custom goes back a really long time. Really long time. People used to make raisin wine because they couldn't get kosher wine. And the fact that they're still doing it in the Nathan household, even though you can go around the corner and get a million kosher wines, is pretty amazing. And that's the end of my presentation for you. And I think I saw Jack say Purim Alegre. So I wish you all a Monadim L'Simcha, a happy holiday, kosher holiday. And don't forget to drink 4 cups of wine or grape juice, unfermented wine. You could even make raisin wine between now and the start of Pesach if you want. And you can use the various recipes you can find. And now I'm going to stop the recording and let everybody talk with one another. If I can, here we go.
No issue with importing There was no issue with importing from Palestine.
What do you mean?
Import.
It was just the opposite. In the initial stages of Prohibition, you you could import wine, uh, again for medicinal or sacramental purposes. But there was a prohibition on. They didn't want people growing wine in California. They didn't want people making wine in America. So it was easier to get imported wine than it was local wine initially. But then it becomes easier to get domestic wines. They start, but it's then the whole bureaucracy grows and grows, and it gets more and
Oh,
more complicated.
you didn't have to account for imported wine?
What do you mean? It was more expensive. It was expensive to get imported
No,
wine.
you don't have to account to Treasury Department and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, there was a whole only authorized dealers. They had to deal. They had all sorts of regulations involved. I only dealt with it from the synagogue side, but there are specific dealers, and and in fact, a lot of the letters being sent to the synagogue are from these dealers. Someone named A.E. Shaw. I don't know what, but a lot of them are from these people, and they give you need this form, you need it notarized, you need to get it this. They tell exactly how to get it. They know their business.
I think raisin wine is the preferred for Kiddush
Yeah, it has the
originally.
fewest problems.
What?
Has the fewest problems.
Yeah, it was
Everything
a
with
mitzvah to
prohibition.
make wine on Erev Shabbat. It was at one point. It was the wife made wine just like she made chali.
Right. Or make your own matzah, right? I mean, nowadays everyone just goes and buys matzah, but back in the day, on Erev Pesach, you made matzah. And I mean, back in the day, I mean, like in the Middle Ages or whatever, you made your
And
three
made wine
matzot for
and made
the Haggadah.
yeah.
My mother remembers them making their own matzot at home in Baghdad. So I would guess they made their own wine also. But now there's no one is left from that generation that I can ask them.
Yeah, too bad.
Yeah.
But that's nice. Yeah, Roger.
Is it certain that raisin wine had no alcohol? I mean, if you leave a sweet liquid for
So, I didn't want to get into it too carefully, but I think for the recipe that David Nathan does, where they boil it and squeeze it, and then the recipe that Mordechai Manuel Noah does, where it's like just a week, it's not going to have much alcohol, if any. But there are recipes that are from that time
Mhm.
where you take raisins, you reconstitute them with water, you mash them, you squeeze out the stuff, you add a little sugar, you add a little yeast if you want. There are different recipes you can find online from the 1820s, 1830s, and you let it sit for 6 months.
Mhm.
And sure, you're going to have a nice alcoholic beverage then.
Yeah, a bad wine.
Yeah.
Does anyone remember the exact wording? What is actually originally required in Hebrew or in Aramaic to drink? Does it say wine? Does it say yain? Does it say mitz anavim? Does it say
I mean, it
anavim?
depends on the source you want to look at, but Mazgulo Kosri, they talk about wine and diluting the wine. But as I showed you, there is in the Gemara itself, even as far back as the Gemara, it says that you can, not for Pesach, it talks about Kiddush, that if
Yeah,
you just squeeze the grapes, you can make Kiddush on it.
you can. Okay.
Diane.
Um, this is just specific to New York. So did the Jews who were in California make wine themselves? Because all of the immigrant Italians in the neighborhoods that I know had made their own wine at home during Prohibition. And I also know that Jews who got out of Europe during World War II and ended up in South America also made their own wine while they were there. They had no other
So I was
source of
thinking
kosher
about putting
wine.
this. I found a little news article from early on in Prohibition, like 1920, 1921, early on in Prohibition from Philadelphia,
Oh.
where a rabbi got arrested because he was making raisin wine, and they say he was making raisin wine, but they tested his raisin wine, and it was alcoholic.
No, I mean, they had
And
fresh
yeah,
grapes.
he was making his own wine and distributing it in Philadelphia.
Yeah,
And they caught him.
okay.
I found something about Baghdad because I just got a new cookbook
Nice.
of Iraqi. This is from the British Iraqi community, and they have a recipe for dried raisin juice, also called qadus.
Kiddush.
So they would
Kiddush,
make it for
right?
kiddush, and it explains how to make raisin wine. You can either soak it or you can boil it, and then you strain it, serve chilled, and they use it for kiddush.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now I have to say, I think the norm and the reason that Mordechai Emanuel Noah says only thinks of it as Passover. A lot of people drank what the rabbis would call stam yenam. A lot of people just drank Gentile wine, but not for Pesach. Pesach, it's like sort of like all year long. I'll drink stam chalav. I'll drink any kind of milk. Passover, though, I'm going to drink chalav Yisrael milk. A lot of people have that custom, had or have. I think that people had they got extra careful at Passover time. Even though all year long Mordechai Emanuel Noah was not worried about what wine he was drinking. Okie doke, everybody. I'm gonna say Moedim Simcha. Have a great evening. Have a great Shabbat, and I'll see you after the holiday.
Thank you.
Can't hear there was.
You, bye.